In 1609, an English sea captain named Henry Hudson sailed into the estuary at the mouth of a great river on behalf of an employer who had given him entirely different instructions. He had been hired by the Dutch East India Company, also known as the VOC, which was the most powerful commercial enterprise in the world. Hudson was sent to find a northeast passage to Asia by sailing above Norway and along the Russian Arctic coast. Needless to say, ice stopped him cold. Rather than turn for home, Hudson disobeyed his contract and pointed the ship west across the Atlantic, chasing rumors of a northwest passage through North America instead. He found no such passage, but he did find a river of extraordinary richness. Forested shores, deep water navigable well into the interior, and indigenous traders offering beaver pelts in abundance. There was a craze for fur hats in Europe. Hudson sailed roughly 150 miles upriver to the vicinity of present-day state capital Albany. He concluded the river was not a route to the Pacific, but he returned to report his findings, and the Dutch had their foothold. It's worth pausing on that detail to note his employer was not a king. The Dutch East India Company was a state-sponsored commercial monopoly with investors. The Dutch governance was the Republic of the Seven United Provinces. The Dutch East India Company operated with the autonomy of a sovereign power. Their settlement of the New Netherlands began as a business venture, and it would remain one, essentially from beginning to end. In 1621, the newly incorporated Dutch West India Company obtained a 24-year trading monopoly in the Americas and Africa, taking over the New Netherland territory from the smaller trading concerns that had been working the region independently since Hudson's voyage. And in March 29, 1624, the ship Nieuw Nederland departed with the first wave of settlers. They weren't, in fact, Dutch. They were Flemish Walloon families, French-speaking Protestant refugees who had fled religious persecution in the Catholic-controlled South. The settlers dispersed across the territory. Some went up the Hudson to Fort Orange, which is today Albany, and a small contingent to Nut Island, now known as Governor's Island. 30 families, sponsored by the Dutch West India Company, moved to Manhattan Island, where a fort was being laid out at the strategic southern tip. Now, in the following year, 1626, a company director named Peter Minuit arrived to take charge of the colony. Minuit is known mostly for arranging what the Dutch recorded as the purchase of the island of Manhattan from the representative of the local Lenape people. A letter written by the Dutch merchant Peter Schocken to the directors of the company stated that Manhattan was purchased for 60 guilders worth of trade. Now, a popular retelling in history books reduces this to $24 in glass beads and trinkets. That $24 figure was first calculated by a historian in 1846 and has been stubbornly persistent ever since. The reality is more complicated. The Lenape people likely saw the transaction as more akin to a lease or a temporary arrangement rather than a permanent sale. The goods exchanged, kettles, axes, cloth, and drilling olives, were practical and genuinely valued. Whether anyone on the Lenape side understood that they were conveying permanent title to the island is in doubt. The settlement that grew up around Fort Amsterdam at the southern tip of Manhattan was unlike anything else in the colonial world. New Amsterdam was founded in 1626 as the capital of New Netherland. The Dutch imprint on New York is most visible in place names. The borough of Brooklyn derives from Breukelen. The Bronx takes its name from Jonas Bronk, a Dutch settler. Harlem, the Bowery, Broadway, Wall Street, all of this comes from the Dutch. The first settlers sent by the company were those Walloon families who stubbornly refused to learn Dutch. They would soon be joined by German, English, Spanish, Scandinavian, and Portuguese colonists. In 1643, 18 languages were reportedly spoken in the small settlement among fewer than 500 residents. The Dutch were actually a vast minority. Diversity was no accident. It was good for business. The Netherlands in the 17th century was Europe's leading commercial power, and its merchants had long understood that tolerance attracted talent, capital, and trading hours. New Amsterdam was just the export model. The Dutch had not considered agriculture profitable. Commerce was a priority for the Dutch West India Company. The colony that would become New York City was, above all, from the beginning, not a plantation or a homestead, but a clearinghouse. Beaver pelts were moved south from Fort Orange and the Hudson Valley to the port at the tip of Manhattan, where they were loaded onto ships bound for Europe. Tobacco was smuggled north from the English colony in Virginia. Sugar moved from the Dutch plantations in South America and the Caribbean, where the West India Company had a parallel and lucrative enterprise running on slave labor. The man who presided over this operation from 1647 to 1664 was Peter Stuyvesant, autocratic, deeply religious, famously one-legged. He was not a colonial governor. He was a company employee and employer. The Dutch West India Company ran New Amsterdam the way a corporation runs a remote branch office. Tight control of the revenues, precious little investment in quality of life. Roads, schools, sewers, any infrastructure were not priorities. Settlers essentially felt neglected during their struggles to establish an overseas colony. Requests for soldiers, defenses, and civic improvements were largely ignored. On August 27, 1664, 4 English frigates, led by Richard Nicolls, sailed into New Amsterdam's harbor and demanded New Netherlands' surrender. They had come on the orders of King Charles II, who had granted the territory to his brother, the Duke of York, while the two countries were at temporary peace. Peter Stuyvesant wanted to fight. The colonists, by most accounts, did not. The West India Company had left them with inadequate defenses, a crumbling fort, and no gunpowder for the cannons. More to the point, the English had offered generous terms. Colonists could keep their property, their businesses, their freedom of worship, and their local customs. Stuyvesant's own council talked him out of resistance. Under the Articles of Surrender, the formal transfer of power was conducted with full military honors. The Dutch simply shrugged and went back to their counting houses under a new flag. What most people don't know is that the story didn't end there. 3 separate Anglo-Dutch wars were fought between 1652 and 1674. The English feared the Dutch would sail up the Thames, break the chains barring the river, and sack the town. Such was the paranoia of the time that the Great London Fire of 1666 was assumed to have been started by Dutch spies. In 1673, during the end of those wars, a combined Dutch fleet commanded by Cornelis Evertsen arrived in the harbor with more ships than the English could resist, about 23, and they took New York back for the Dutch. They chose Antony Kalf as governor and renamed the city New Orange after William of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder who had recently come to power. Dutch form of government was restored. Records reverted to Dutch form, Dutch officials retook their posts, and the streets of the city heard Dutch spoken again with official authority. New Orange, formerly New York, formerly New Amsterdam, lasted for 15 months. After peace was finally restored between the Netherlands and England, the Dutch returned New York to English rule under the Treaty of Westminster, signed February 1674, in exchange for the South American colony of Suriname, a sugar-producing territory considered by the Dutch to be far more valuable prize. News of the treaty arrived in the New World weeks later. The handover occurred in November. For those 15 months, though, the city was called New Orange. Then, when the treaty was signed in Europe, a word arrived in the harbor and the English flag went back up. Now, 14 years later, that same William of Orange landed with a Dutch army in England in 1688 at the invitation of English Protestants, who were alarmed at James II's Catholic fervor. James II essentially fled the country rather than fight, and 4 months later, William and his wife Mary who was James's own rebellious Protestant daughter, were crowned jointly as William III and Mary II. So a man who was not the king of the Netherlands, but a stadtholder of a republic, and for whom the Dutch very deliberately named New Orange just to mock the English, ended up on the English throne just 15 years later, a king. For one brief shining moment, for 15 months, New York wasn't the Big Apple, it was Big Orange country. Thanks for listening to The Artificial Fun with Bumaga. Check out the streaming audio feed at bumaga.com, live broadcasts on wozoradio.com, Tuesdays 6 to 8 p.m. Be well, do good work, and keep in touch.